Thank you all for joining me today for the 14th of our Colombia CBIPS lecture series on the AEC experience relating to COVID-19. I'm Fenioski Peñamora, Executive Director of Columbia Center for Buildings, Infrastructure, and Public Space, and Edwin Howard Armstrong Professor of Civil Engineering and Engineering Mechanics at Columbia's Full Foundation School of Engineering and Applied Science. As the events of the last months have demonstrated, we are living during exceedingly challenging times, characterized by divides, distrust, and distancing. However far apart we have been, however far apart we currently are, we need to learn to come together, to be together, to act together for social, economic, and environmental justice. I hope that the events of these days bring better understanding of the injustices that exist and become a catalyst to bring about real change for all. Along with many of our colleagues in New York City and around the world, the faculty and staff of the Center for Buildings, Infrastructure, and Public Space would like to add our voices to those decrying institutional racism in the AEC industry. Today, our industry has a challenging work ahead to achieve true racial and gender inclusion. We need to stand with our Black architects, Black engineers, Black contractors, Black suppliers, and Black community. We need to listen better, to learn better, and to incorporate the lessons of diversity and distress into the way we, all working together, reshape economically challenged communities. We need to build a better future for our industry, characterized by respect, opportunity, and collaboration. Acknowledging these aspirations and commitments, our lecture program will continue every Tuesday at noon into September with 19 talks from leaders in both the public and the private sectors. The lectures bring people together to address the impact, response, recovery, and preparedness of the architecture, engineering, and construction community in regard to the coronavirus pandemic. These talks also relate to issues of social, economic, and environmental justice to the new normal post-COVID-19 AEC world. Our past speakers were from New York, London, Los Angeles, Paris, Boston, Washington, D.C., and Sao Paulo. They all addressed the experiences of their offices in relating to COVID-19 impact, response, recovery, and preparedness. We have heard about public buildings, civic infrastructures, COVID-19 medical facilities, and challenges in office operations. Subsequent talks will focus on COVID-19 emergency hospital construction in China and on design and construction in Seoul. Please check our website to see more information about our next speakers and co-moderators. I also would like to thank the organizations with whom we are collaborating in presenting these lectures. They are the American Council of Engineering Companies, New York. I would like to thank James Simpson for their support. The American Institute of Architects, New York chapter. I would like to thank Ben Krosky for their support. The American Society of Civil Engineers. I would like to thank Tom Smith. The Consortium for Sustainable Urbanization. I would like to thank Lance Brown. The Construction Management Association of America, New York, New Jersey. I would like to thank Vinny Polkowski for his support. Engineering News Record, thanks Jan Tuckman. And National Academy of Construction. I would like to thank Wayne Crew. Today, we turn to the experiences and lessons learned in Chicago, the city known for the invention of the skyscraper and innovations in hydrology, including changing the direction of its river, but which also, as the nation's transportation hub, gave us the invention of standardized time zones. My co-moderator today is Professor Nora Elgari, who joined the Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign in 2009. Professor Elgari earned her Bachelor of Science and Bachelor of Science degrees in Construction Engineering from the American University in Cairo and her PhD in Civil Engineering from the University of Toronto. She has received numerous research awards, including the National Science Foundation Career Award in 2013, and most recently, been designated a faculty fellow by the National Center of Supercomputing Applications. Dr. Elgari is active in the American Society of Civil Engineers and currently serves as Vice Chair of the Executive Committee of the AEC Construction Research Council. Thank you for being here today, Nora. Our speaker today is Biagi, Commissioner of the Chicago Department of Transportation. Gia is an urban planner and designer with experience in the private and public sectors, who was appointed Commissioner of the Chicago Department of Transportation by Mayor Lori Lightfoot in December 2009. The mayor charged Commissioner Biagi with implementing a vision for a transportation system that prioritizes equity and mobility and works to lower the economic and environmental burden of transportation, especially for people in poverty and people with disabilities. As Commissioner of CDOT, she oversees a department responsible for Chicago's roadways and bridges, sidewalks and bike lanes, the citywide bike share program, traffic signals and signage, street lights, and the permitting of activities in the public right-of-way. Before answering Mayor Lightfoot's call to return to public service, Commissioner Biagi was a principal at Studio Gang Architects, one of the Chicago and the world's leading architecture and urban design firms. At Studio Gang, she developed and led the urbanism for urbanism and civic impact practice that specialized in urban design, planning, and strategy. Prior to joining Studio Gang, she spent more than a decade in public service as a planner for the city of Chicago, with roles that included Chief of Staff for the Chicago Park District, as well as with the Department of Planning and Development. Commissioner Biagi attended the University of Michigan for her Bachelor's of Arts degree and has a Master in Urban Planning and Policy from the University of Illinois at Chicago. To learn more about both Commissioner Biagi and Dr. Elgari, please visit the CBIPS website. Thank you, Commissioner, for being here with us today. We look to listen to your talk.
Great, thank you. Thanks for the kind introduction. In fact, I don't think there's much more that you could say about me at that point, so I appreciate it. I also want to know, I see a former colleague from Studio Gang who is on the line here, so thanks, Greg, if that's you, I thought it was, for joining. Again, thank you to Fenioski and Rick Bell and Nora for inviting me to this forum. You know, I really appreciate the opportunity to talk about a little about the Chicago Department of Transportation and the city. We call it CDOT out here, so you'll hear me use that phrase quite a bit. But it's really, I think, a really important moment to reflect kind of while we're in the midst of things about what we've been doing over the last couple of months. So I'm going to share my screen and walk through a little bit of a deck here, and we'll get into it. Okay. Okay, can everyone see my screen, I hope? Heads are nodding, yes. I'm going to assume that's the case.
Yes, we can see, we can see your screen, yes.
Great. All right, so thank you so much again for having me here. And you can see this is kind of a view of Chicago that gives you a sense of all of the assets and components that we manage here at the Chicago Department of Transportation. You know, we are a department of about 1,300 employees across the entire city of Chicago. And in every city, you'll find that the Department of Transportation is a little bit different in terms of what they manage. In our case, we are all of the public way. So whether that is your street or your sidewalk, your alley, that includes street lights, that includes all the potholes that we need to fix, traffic signals, as well as services like our bike share system, which we call Divvy here in Chicago, scooters that I can talk about as well. I'm sure there are questions about it. And we're also working hand in glove with our Chicago Transit Authority, who run the trains and the buses in our city, where we build the train stations and we help develop the bus network in partnership. So it's really kind of a hand in glove relationship. We have some other kind of oddball authorities, including being harbor master, which means that I get to wear a captain's hat and have a bugle. But it also means that we help manage the landside component of our extensive river system that really, toward Fenioski's point in the beginning, really Chicago in its inception was at the confluence of a lot of systems, the river, of course, and its connection to the Great Lakes, and then ultimately down the Mississippi River to the Gulf. But then also in terms of how the movement of goods and materials moved across the country, and our train network, our freight network being absolutely critical to the movement of goods across the whole country. And so you can see kind of in these vignettes on the screen, just a sampling of what we do. So I really like to say it, in the Department of Transportation, we move from policy to potholes. So whether that's working with the rideshare companies and on congestion pricing to literally filling that pothole that hopefully you don't have on your street, that's the kind of thing that we work on every day. So I appreciate the opportunity to think about where we've been when it comes to COVID-19 and kind of where we're going. This is our mayor, Mayor Lightfoot, who, as was mentioned in the beginning, appointed me to this position only a few months ago, actually. About 6 or 7 months in, and it felt like I came in under cover of darkness, and then suddenly we had this thing called COVID-19 in front of us, and we learned phrases like flatten the curve and how to really treat seriously what your health commissioner is saying about how you need to operate. And so I'll talk a little bit about what that meant here at the Department of Transportation. I mean, as a city as a whole, obviously Chicago, like many Midwestern cities, is experiencing regionally kind of different ebbs and flows in terms of the virus. And what that means, of course, in terms of how we operate, everything from our transit system and what does social distancing look like on that, to continuing to operate as the bulk of my workforce are essential workers, to then how can we respond to new needs for public space? What does that look like in a new normal that continues to evolve as a normal of many kinds? And I think, in our mayor, this is, her serious face. And I think she's someone who comes across as very serious and is not only about how we respond to COVID, not only how we move forward together as a city and recover, but also at the root of the city as a whole. What are we doing about racial equity? What are we doing about generational poverty? Those are the kinds of challenges that she's put in front of all of us, and as well our transportation department. And that's something that we're trying to bring forward through this COVID crisis, but long into the future. So when you look at, this is just a quick scattershot, frankly, of all the things that we've had to be partners on or support as our city, as your cities, I'm sure, are doing very similar things, whether that's developing housing assistance, whether that's closing big public open space systems in order to reduce community spread of the virus, whether it's reopening schools. And you can see at the bottom of the screen, the 5 blocks at the bottom are about the Recovery Task Force. So one of the roles that we played in transportation was to be about both how do you reopen, what do those phases look like for your transit system, what does that look like in terms of what happens in the public way, and then how do you recover? For example, one of the things that we launched was a program called Recovery Through Infrastructure, and that's where we looked at all the kinds of construction work that we do and how you could optimize that for recovery. And I'll touch on that in a little bit. But it's really important, of course, that we acknowledge that the systemic inequalities in our city, the systemic inequities in our city, which of course aren't the same thing, were really brought into sharp focus with the murder of George Floyd that stimulated conversation across the world, really, and particularly in Chicago. And this is something that I think every city is negotiating through differently. When our mayor came into office, as I mentioned, it was one of the prime challenges that she put on the table, and I think what we're experiencing now is kind of shown how that is writ large right now. And so it's become really a more, even a finer point of how we move forward together. So in response to COVID, one of the things that we did was launch a program called Our Streets. And the idea here is that our streets belong to everyone. It's so often thought that the governing body, that we have carte blanche and we do what we want, and we can pave your street if we feel like it, and we can take over the sidewalk or give a permit for this or that. But at the end of the day, fundamentally, our streets belong to all of us. That is, the street plays this fundamental role as a front yard, as a place where communities come together, where we build those relationships that make for trust, that make communities strong. All of the kinds of pieces of a great public realm have everything to do with how we live together. And so our lens toward responding, not only during COVID, but in the long term, was really putting in the forefront this idea that we all own this in common, that our streets are part of this civic commons, and what we do with them, we have to decide to do together. And I think part and parcel of that is that our streets themselves mean different things in different communities. This is a great set of images actually from the Chicago Tribune that captures what was happening in Chicago during COVID. Whether it was folks who couldn't go to church who then prayed on the sidewalk, whether it was folks figuring out how to distribute food and face coverings, whether in the upper right-hand corner you can see this is a group of folks that collected plantings and flowers from medians and other public places and gave them to mothers who had lost children to gun violence, gave them to those mothers on Mother's Day. These are the kinds of connections that came about as COVID has forced us to really think about what's important and then how do we use what we own in common together. Now, what we did in Chicago, and I certainly hear it a lot through the interwebs, that nothing was ever fast enough, or you should be closing all the streets down and making them car-free immediately. That there's certainly an urgency, and we understood that. But what was important for us was to work in a very methodical way, particularly hand in glove with our health commissioner. I think this is certainly a moment for health commissioners. We have one in particular that was already engaged in public way thinking, that in fact our health department was already part of an extensive program thinking about how streets are important for play, how they could invest in them in order to move the needle on quality of life questions like whether it's asthma rates or obesity or those kinds of things. So that connection between the built environment and the Department of Transportation was already there. And in this case, so where we started, our initial responses during COVID was to get really good information out to make sure that the facts about how the virus was doing in Chicago was disseminated widely. And this was a case of me going on a live stream Facebook broadcast, but in order to answer questions from the public directly, that is to listen really well. And I think that listening is what really characterizes everything that we do. We believe here in Chicago in local lived experience, that local knowledge that comes from neighborhoods, that is that Mrs. Jones who lives on the block, who knows more about her street than I ever will, that is the kind of expertise and special information that we need to value as much as technical expertise or what we might know as transportation providers. And so building those relationships and bringing out that local knowledge and listening well was part of it. That said, the second kind of initiative that we rolled out was giving advice, right? Remember, if you go back, people were trying to figure out, well, what do I do in the public way? Can I walk? Do I wear a mask? How far away do I need to be from the person walking in front of me? What about driving? We certainly saw escalated speeds in areas of the city that are particularly already under siege in terms of high levels of traffic crashes. We saw speeds increase, in fact, multiple miles per hour above usual levels, even though we were seeing volumes down. It was different across the city, I will say, in areas where you had essential workers, folks who still needed to drive to work or take public transportation. We saw levels of volumes that were only about 70% of normal, which is high compared to our central business district, which saw traffic volumes down 50% of normal. And so we needed to get information out there, and as well, work with the media to make sure that folks are getting the word out on taking it easy, driving slow, those kinds of things. But this is where I think it gets particularly interesting. So we certainly heard about lots of cities, whether it was New York or Oakland, that were quickly rolling out shared streets. And everyone has a different name for it. They're often they might be called slow streets. They are when you close down a street to vehicular traffic or some semblance of that and prioritize it for walking and biking and those kinds of things. And it can be really transformative, and you'll see in some of the images that follow what that looks like in Chicago. Many cities just went ahead and did that, and I definitely communicated and listened to my peers in other cities. asking questions about, well, what was your public outreach like? What was your engagement like? And most folks said, well, there's no time. And so we just had to roll it out. And so we did. And in Chicago, we actually took a different tact. We took a breath and we said, well, why don't we listen to communities and learn about what they need, what they're looking for? Because even though that might feel like a slow process, the speed of trust is slow. And for us, we need to build relationships. This was an opportunity to better understand what people were experiencing in their neighborhoods. So we actually conducted outreach and did Zoom community meetings and did surveys. We had thousands of responses, really asking, one, what is your lived experience in your neighborhood right now during COVID? What are the kinds of improvements that we could make? What would you like to see? And this map in front of you is this map of Chicago. North is up, the lake is to the east or to the right. You can see that we got a very different range of responses. You see in that salmon colored band, quite a few folks that were responding to the idea of shared streets. And in our city, you know, we have certainly divides of north, south, and west sides of the city. North side, predominantly wealthier, whiter, south and west, Latinx and African American. And as you probably know, we are a segregated city in a way that's been stitched into the built environment over decades by policy choices and by racist practices, whether that's in lending, whether that's in real estate, in any number of ways. And it continues to be part of what defines quite a bit of the geography and the possibilities and opportunities in neighborhoods. And so you can see the shared streets was a big request in that band along the lakefront and heading north. And this is actually, this is over the entire period. Initially, we only saw a little bit of interest, mostly on that north side of the city. But you look at that west and southwest band, the blues and the greens, and we got a very different set of responses. In the south side, folks are actually most interested in having more biking opportunities and having more protected bikeways or opportunities to use the bike share program. We were hearing concerns about speeding. In community meetings that I attended, we heard folks say, don't do a shared street. I use my car, I need to get through. Why don't you just fix the street? We'd rather have you do construction on our street than actually close it. So I think that was pretty instructive for us as a process. And then we began to roll out our shared streets through that engagement. This is Drexel Boulevard, which is on the south side of the city. And again, we have a long conversation and a deep history of inequitable distribution of resources across the city, and primarily to the benefit of the north side. And part of the prospect of shared streets, the narrative before we did anything was that the north side would get all the shared streets. And you could see that's certainly where the demand was coming from, but it meant that we had to do more to engage and make sure we were listening really well. And so this is Drexel Boulevard, which is 2 miles of shared street on its own. And you can see folks, they operationalize it in different ways, whether it's for biking and walking, or whether it's for protest, whether it's for testing out some of our bike share. The idea here was that this was an important possibility for people to define what it is they wanted to use in these spaces, what they wanted to do in these spaces. And in fact, we're in conversations now with community-based organizations that are interested in what peace in the streets might look like. That is, how do we create spaces in our public way to enable folks to have, for example, peace circle conversations where people in neighborhoods and police actually talk to one another and try to build some trust, and do that perhaps in the public way. You know, so we've continued to roll this program out. And I think what's interesting here, so we have some data coming in slowly as we've been surveying people who live along those shared streets. So again, we listen, what is it that you're interested in? What is the set of tools that we can bring and work in solidarity with neighbors? And then after it's been rolled out, to say, how's it going? What did you like about it? Would you like more in the future? And I think we're certainly hearing that, you know, almost 70% of folks who've answered the survey have said, we want this in the future. And so what's important here, right, is what we're doing is we are creating a proof of concept, that we are testing out the possibility that a street is about more than movement. It's also about place. It always has been, but how the public could reclaim it in a way that is meaningful, whether it's during COVID or whether it's in the future. That's what's really exciting about these programs. And so many cities have their own version of these. I think we've also rolled out Streateries or cafe streets or whatever you want to call them, make way for dining, I think, as we've called it, which, you know, as a, I guess I'm a bureaucrat now again, which was an incredibly difficult process when you think it's as simple as, well, we'll just put some tables and chairs in the street. But obviously the rules around food service and using the public way and liquor and closing down streets and moving bus routes if you needed to, those kinds of things. It's an extremely complicated process. And what we did was we created a special application and to allow people to allow restaurants in clusters of 3 or through business associations or special service areas to use the street for outdoor dining. It's been incredibly successful. In fact, you know, we have had over 140 locations across our city that have outdoor dining, whether it's an expansion of the sidewalk or in the street. About 26 of those are full-on closed streets. And really, we're serving about 300 restaurants across the city right now. We've also been working with our Department of Planning to beautify some of these locations, prioritizing areas in the south and west side that don't have the same kinds of resources that some of our higher end restaurant clusters do. And so really trying to bring these opportunities, put a little money back in people's pockets, create opportunities for people to be outside. And what we've seen again is that fundamental shift in thinking that is happening, where people are telling us, we should have this year round, we should do this all the time, we should have piazzas, these kinds of possibilities that truly weren't there in Chicago. They were only teasing at the margins of adding, you know, some pop-up space in a parking lane. But this has fundamentally altered the way people see what the streets can do for them on a year-round basis. If you think about it as adding acres and miles and square feet of new public open space in a way people hadn't thought possible, it does that as well. It's deprioritizing the car in a way that prioritizes pedestrians, right? The goal here is that our most vulnerable populations are prioritized. That's walking, that's biking, and then the modes on up from there, prioritizing public transit and then vehicular. This is really creating a conversation that will not disappear when COVID does. Hopefully, eventually it does. I think another thing that we've been doing during COVID was providing more mobility. And one of the ways that we do that is, one, by partnering with the Chicago Transit Authority, and I'll talk a little bit about that, but then also looking at how is it that we get people to engage with your non-vehicular modes of travel. So Divvy, as I mentioned, those blue bikes are our bike share system. By geography, it is the largest bike share system in the country, and it's only getting bigger. So what we did 2 weeks ago is we began an expansion of our program. We're adding 55 more square miles, 55 square miles to the system, rolling it out rolling out to our southern city limits. And then by the end of next year, we will have bike share in every corner of the entire city of Chicago. That is of a magnitude that's not seen anywhere in the country. We also done things like offered classes for adults to learn to ride a bike. I'll show you some figures in a second about the challenges that people feel toward taking public transit, biking, walking, becoming priorities now, of course. And so we actually teach adults how to ride bikes. We actually have also used bikes in support of violence prevention efforts in the streets by providing free bikes for communities to roll through neighborhoods that have been distressed in a mass show of re-engagement and reclamation of the public realm at night, and also as a trust building exercise with people and police. And so these are some of the things that we've been doing around mobility. I should say we've also, we offered programs that cut the price in half during COVID to make it as easy as possible for people to sign up for a membership. We did something called $1 Divvy rides, and we had more than 28,000 people take advantage of using a bike, a lot of new members into the system. And so again, COVID was an opportunity to introduce new ways of moving around the city and to generate kind of that community support for bikes and bikeways and the kinds of pieces that add to our transit network. And then also, you know, and we have a big role to play with our Chicago Transit Authority, also our Metro, which is a suburban to city train system, as well with some of the other systems that provide paratransit for people with disabilities. And one of our roles during COVID has been to convene all of these actors, from whether it was those suburban bus systems to Uber and Lyft, to scooter companies, to our own train system. We've had to be a convener as the industry was trying to figure out, well, how is it we reopen? What do we need to do in a taxi? What do we need to do on a bus? How do we make public transit still a viable option when many people have feared that it would be a vector for the virus? And in fact, the data that you see on the screen comes from a partnership we have with Boston Consulting Group to interview some of the major companies that work in the Central Business District in Chicago, and some of our other economic centers, to really understand what kind of a health risk employees were associating with modes of transit. And you can see, of course, the least risk associated in their minds with transit were biking and walking and private car as well. And when you look at public transit, there's high fear in terms of risk for using it. But the fact is, particularly in our Black and brown communities, where we have high levels of essential workers that don't have access to a car or don't have the ability to pay for a parking space in our economic centers, public transit is more key than ever. So part of what we've been doing is collaborating with our CTA on how can we create additional pop-up busways where we can run more buses more frequently with fewer people per bus that can allow for that social distancing. So we have some things that we expect to be rolling out over the next couple of weeks on that front. Those are the kinds of COVID responses, though, that fit into a much larger conversation that we've been having about reimagining the bus network. For me, you know, it's at the Department of Transportation where I am, we're like the tabletop, right? And trains and buses, these are all the pieces that need to move around. So we have this ability to think holistically about how these systems move. And the bus is this fundamental, granular mode of transit that could be the most accessible, frankly, around our city. And so the investments we make now, again, are trying to be an on-ramp to a much larger systemic change that we want to see happen that prioritizes public transportation over vehicle movement. I think the last piece that I wanted to touch on before talking a little bit more about the future, but I promise to wrap up in about 5 minutes, is essential work. And so, you know, in addition to these kinds of policy initiatives that I've talked about and these changes to the public realm, you know, we are a department that never went home for COVID. I should say we have about 900 folks that do the tree planting, they fixing bridges, putting up signs, managing the traffic signal network, helping to clean up neighborhoods after some of the damage has happened to our commercial corridors, even, you know, as recently as this week. Our crews are not only doing their day-to-day work, they're also trying to help communities recover throughout as we're navigating between both COVID and unrest in our own city. And these are folks who are perhaps unsung, but they are keeping the city together in a lot of ways. And we've been able to also in COVID accelerate our construction timelines, take advantage of less traffic on the streets. And then thinking about, and I mentioned earlier, recovery through infrastructure. So what we've been doing is very prescriptively looking at the kinds of work that we can put out for bid. And some work actually hits different parts of the labor market, right? That makes a ton of sense. More specialized work is going to hit certain industries, certain folks with different skill sets get brought on for those jobs. What we were looking for is how do you prioritize work to put out to bid that gets as many people employed as possible who are in vulnerable populations, so particularly low-wage workers. So for example, we've really prioritized things like our ADA ramps that are how you create an easy incline for a wheelchair or for a stroller to get up the edge of a sidewalk. Those are very labor intensive. It opens up a wide funnel to hiring people who are in that lower rung of the labor market, and so we can get money back into the pockets of people who need it the most. Those are the kinds of things that we're investing in, as well as looking at what are the major infrastructure pieces that we could invest in for the long term, that we send the signal now that Chicago is open for business, that we're putting shovels in the ground, that we are a city constantly on the rebuild, moving toward a brighter future. So that was about our streets. And I'm just going to wrap up by talking a little bit quickly about our city in a more broader sense. You know, I mentioned earlier that we have a lot of reconciliation to do with regard to the systemic racism that has produced so much of the inequities in our city. And this is a poverty map comparison. So what you're looking at on the left in 1970 is the distribution of income. And you know, you're looking 40 years later, and you can really see the concentration of wealth and the distribution of poverty across our city. It is stark. And one of the really important pieces of our mayor's emphasis has been, how do you reduce generational poverty? How do we change this map? Because this map is fundamentally a construct of policy. It's fundamentally a construct of choices that private sector and government has made. And so how do we not just unmake those, but how do we make up? How do we move forward? And how do we recreate that map in our city? And how that, you know, relates to transportation in so many ways that we see in that map of inequity and inequality in our city. You can see it with something like public transit to work. As I mentioned earlier, many essential workers have to take public transit. And this scatter plot is showing you on the left, you can see the case rate, and then on the axis on the bottom, you can see public transportation to work. And so communities in that kind of upper right square, if you know scatter plots, I mean, these are folks who have these are neighborhoods with the highest case rates, that coincides with high levels of comorbidities, that coincides with having to take public transit to work. So there's a fundamental importance in the investments that we make in order to address the underlying conditions of the comorbidities, to address the front of mind COVID response, but then how do we make sure that this public transit system is working for people, is as safe as possible? All of those pieces kind of coalesce here as we think about what we do next. So at my department, we've begun a major strategic planning process that is recreating what our core values are, and then we'll develop a set of strategies and tactics and metrics toward that end. And primary is that question of equity and justice. What does mobility justice look like in our city? What should it look like? Not just the freedom of movement, but also the freedom to stay in place, to be safe on the sidewalk, to be safe in the street, no matter what mode, no matter what your destination is. One of the big initiatives you'll hear from transportation departments is often talking about something called Vision Zero. So Vision Zero was an international campaign that New York has adopted, and most of your major cities, about reducing traffic crashes, fatalities from traffic crashes, to zero, because they're fundamentally preventable. What we're doing in Chicago is saying yes, and the and is that there's more kinds of violence in our streets than traffic crashes. And if we as a transportation department don't begin to understand our streets as places and that we have a role to play in reducing all kinds of violence, then we're really not going to get to where we need to be in terms of equity and justice. And so those are the kinds of ideas where we are stretching an idea like Vision Zero to encapsulate the lived experience of people in our neighborhoods and of a key public policy question that we absolutely need to address. Justice also touches on climate, another adaptive challenge. How do we address climate in everything we do? How do we ask ourselves that question every day and then embed it in our organization? That is the work, the hard work of the strategic planning that we're doing. And also, when it comes to recovery, there needs to be a just recovery, right? So how do we prioritize where we're putting our investments? How do we prioritize where we're delivering services and lifting up our communities in COVID and post-COVID in a way that is fair and that is working in partnership with communities? Another important pillar of our strategic planning is about access. And I talked a little bit about that in terms of the bus network. But what does it mean to have that granular accessibility to our trains, to our buses, to bikes, to even scooters? We're about to land 10,000 scooters on the city of Chicago for the next 4 months. And it's not about the scooter as a toy or a fun object. It's about being a fundamental piece of the mobility network that can work for that first mile or that first half mile and that last half mile, those smaller trips and in places where it's harder to get reliability from the transit system right now. And then investment, as I mentioned. One of the important initiatives of Mayor Lightfoot is an initiative called Invest South and West that is looking at those South and West Side communities and saying, how do we leverage $1 billion of investment here for economic development that includes what each department can do in terms of the built environment improvements in addition to the services, but partnered with community-based organizations and getting the investment community, whether that's banks, whether that's developers, any number of private actors to the table to say, here are the parts of our city that we need to find equity for and get on a path toward recovery. And that's what that looks like across this map. And what we're doing from CDOT's perspective toward this end is hand in glove with our COVID response, but as well, we're looking to get even more granular, to really look at that block scale and what does it look like in terms of that experience in these community areas at that 1 or 2 block intersection? What are the investments we can make? But more fundamentally, how do we build partnership with communities in a way that they're at the table, not just to sit there, but to make decisions to help guide where our investments go? Because at the end of the day, it's residents who live with the decisions that we make every day as government officials. And so it's our job, it's an imperative to make sure that that is done in solidarity. So, you know, I'll wrap up here with really saying COVID certainly is, if you know, it's certainly incredible. I don't even put to words how unusual this experience is, but it does make us see all of the cracks, all of the fissures that we knew were there, and it pulls them apart a little wider, and it's painful, and we need to respond to the urgency of that pandemic, and in partnership respond to the urgency of the other epidemics that we're experiencing. And the only way we can do that from a government perspective, in my view, is an all hands on deck, whole government approach, where we say, what are the tools I have in my pocket? How do I put that in service of communities? How do I prioritize their local lived experience? And how do we take ownership together of those solutions that we can provide? So with that, I'll leave it there. I want to, again, thank you for the opportunity to talk a little bit about Chicago. There's a lot more I could say. And as I mentioned, it was really a great question to be asked to reflect a little bit on what we've been doing and where we're going in the moment that we're in. So with that, I think we can have a little bit of Q&A and I'll stop talking.
Thank you, Commissioner. Can you hear me well? Thank you so much for an enlightening presentation about the experiences in Chicago. I'm particularly coming from Illinois. I'm very excited about this. You showed us an exciting vision for a transportation system that prioritizes equity and mobility for residents and communities, something that is becoming increasingly important at this challenging time. Thank you, Fanny and Rick, as well, for putting this important lecture series together. Maybe one question comes to mind. With the pandemic and the need to prioritize equity and justice, and we realizing more and more the role of every person and how it is vital to come out of the pandemic and how it is vital to improve equity and justice, there is a lot of issues to deal with. But we can see, as you mentioned, these are as challenges or maybe an opportunity for us to change how we do things for a better way. You also mentioned the importance of bringing in local knowledge and how this is vital, and the importance of bringing input from everyone, especially the vulnerable. So how is all this changing? How we will do the public consultation and the public involvement process in the future? How is the process itself changing? So you mentioned many examples that are great here or there, but I'm wondering how we could change the process of the public involvement and consultation and all of this to better reflect the needs and the priorities, also in the planning and design in a more structured and a more organized way. So we make sure that as we move forward, these are not just becoming temporary activities that we do, but rather become really permanent solutions and become permanent way of how we do things and how we keep improving.
Yeah, thank you for the question. Yeah, I think there are a couple of things, and I think there are some key principles, right, in terms of as we think about how we engage now and toward the future. And for me, I think that is something to consider, that the practices of engagement can vary from neighborhood to neighborhood, from block to block, really, because folks have different ways of communicating, different sets of needs. You always need to meet people where they are in terms of what they're thinking about top of mind. And so I think while there are lots of good practices, it's less about finding the best practice. It's more about what are your principles? What are the best principles that underpin that engagement? And then the tactics and the tools, and there's a million of them, those can follow. And so, you know, I think some of those principles are, one, as I mentioned, you got to meet people where they are. That's very hard physically during COVID. Although I will say what we've been doing, making sure we're meeting people in the places they're concerned about, at a social distance, wearing masks, all those kinds of things, because it's important to not sort of armchair quarterback everything. It's very hard to understand someone's lived experience if you're not in their neighborhood at a minimum. So I think there's a principle of meeting people where they are. I think the second important principle for us is that idea I mentioned of valuing local, on the street, lived experience as much as any expert. Well, we pay plenty of consultants for their expertise. One of the things that I did in my previous life at Studio Gang, and then I am working on how we can do it here, is actually paying people to participate. So this means, for example, we have many community-based organizations that are interested in the same kinds of questions, or if we're asking folks to participate in a conversation, we ought to consider, one, particularly with young people, a stipend to participate. Think two, offering up funds for an actual project. Too often we are doing tactical things with nothing that follows it. And that's certainly part of my concern with the longevity of things like shared streets. I'm loath, frankly, to do something pop-up that a small group of people decided, for example, with things like maybe you've heard about Parking Day, where a group of folks say, well, we're gonna make that parking space a park for a day. And that sounds great, but I wonder, did you ask the people who live there? Did you ask the folks, the retailer who actually kind of needs that parking? Not that I'm pro parking. It's only for a day. So what kind of sustainable response is that? And so I think we do need to figure out how we can bring more funds to the table for that second step, right? It's usually easy to get the pop-up thing in place. How do we get something, at least so the pop-up are breadcrumbs toward a larger item, or that we're willing to say, this pop-up doesn't work, and we're willing to come back and try something else. So not just the one-off for sake of it, and not just to say, we're gonna give up on it if it doesn't work. So I think there needs to be sort of that commitment to funds, money, to commitment to valuing people's time. Pizza is not enough of a payment for intellectual capital that comes from a neighborhood experience I can never match. So know that we don't have it perfect here, but that's something that's really important. I think the last thing I'll add is, one thing our city launched was a racial equity rapid response team. It's a lot of R's in the acronym, but the idea here is that we were seeing COVID comorbidity rates and COVID positive rates in our Black and brown communities disproportionately beyond what you were seeing in white communities. And so our city launched a specific campaign to both do the outreach, to provide services, education about masks, really dispelling myths that were out about social distancing. And so I think being willing to flag something and saying, that is a racial equity issue, we've got to go after it, we're going to put resources behind it, and we're going to be in communities trying to make change. It's not going to do it all on its own, but I think that's another example of how you might respond. And I probably should pause and let you say something. I know you want to talk about how these translate to the long term, and I just think these are all proofs of concept, and that we just have to be willing to be flexible and respond to communities in the way that they need to.
Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner. I will just say that listening to your presentation and hearing the approach that you have taken, Chicagoans are in good hands. I really like your approach of asking the question, really trying to understand what each neighborhood wants, what the community wants, because at the end of the day, as you mentioned, this is about serving the community. So we have heard a couple of questions now from participants. We have one from your former colleague that is asking one that if you have a magic wand, what would you do moving forward? So I don't know if you would like to share your thoughts on that.
That must be from my friend Greg Garmiza. Thank you, Greg. So you know what I do? I would use a magic wand to make more magic wands and hand them out to folks who are in our most vulnerable communities right now. Folks who are, whether it's Auburn Gresham and Englewood, whether it's South Shore, Belmont Cragen, all neighborhoods that you saw on that map, and put magic wands in the hands of young people and magic wands in the hands of your most local community-based organizations, not the ones who get invited to every press conference, not the ones who are in all of the networks, but the folks like, you know, Diane Latiker here, who does Kids Off the Block, who basically took over a vacant lot across the street from her house and makes up programming for young people to engage in because it keeps kids safe. And there's a memorial to over 100 kids who've been killed by violence in streets. I want to give a magic wand to people like that who every day are doing the hard work and that don't always get the support that they need.
Great.
Thank you. Wonderful response.
We have
really
some.
Goes along with your thought of ensuring that everybody has the means to affect change. Thank you so much.
Sure. Well, and there could be a lot of chaos with a lot of magic wands, but you know, we could figure out the logistics later.
We have some more questions coming in from the audience. We have a question from Alexander Wagner. Returning to the concept of recovery through infrastructure, what projects are you considering and where would funding for these projects come from? You mentioned one example, being ADA or having ADA accessible ramps, but here the question is wondering if you might think of other more options and which involves more or less workers and how to prioritize.
Yeah, that's a great question. So the recovery through infrastructure is working in a couple of frames. One piece is really internally, we have a lot of our own procurement and hiring practices that are antiquated or too slow or aren't streamlined at all. And that fundamentally reduces the jobs pipeline, right? If it takes one, it increases the cost of a project. If it takes too long to get under contract and get out to bid and all of that. And then in a COVID environment where there was lots of initially uncertainty about who was going to be allowed to work and what could be active in the economy, and construction was one that of course could, but that we need to streamline our practices to send a signal to the community of folks who do the hiring, who are the contractors, that kind of thing, to say, we're going to do this process faster. You can feel confident to hire. We have a giant capital program that's coming out that you should keep your subs on, keep people employed, keep your supply chains active. So there's some signaling that we're doing with that. So there's the in-house cleanup of our procurement and hiring, and those are conversations that we're in right now, frankly, trying to make change in that regard. Then there's also that other kind of signal, which is we're open for business. So some of the capital funding, we were lucky that in our state, we have a bond called Rebuild Illinois, and that was something that was issued before COVID. So we have the lucky situation of not having to have that bond issuance respond to the weird market right now. Mm-hmm. And so incrementally, we will get a couple $100 million for a number of capital projects, everything from arterial resurfacing, sidewalks and streetscapes, lighting, those kinds of things. So that's really a gratifying source of funds. We also continue to leverage funds that are here in the city. Love them or hate them or do both. TIFs still remain a lever that's not always ideal, but it's a reality that is also a funding source for some of the built improvements. So there are a couple things we're cobbling together. We're looking in our city at doing a capital bond in the fall. So I'm hopeful for that because we do have a lot of work that we need to get done. I think also one of the things I'll add is that I talked about bike share a lot. That bike share program generates revenue for the Department of Transportation to reinvest in bike lanes, bike infrastructure, that Vision Zero kind of work of creating pedestrian islands and bump outs and those kinds of things. So we cobble it together. We are concerned because some of our funding sources are based on things like the motor fuel tax, which is frankly, we don't want to have to encourage folks to drive in order to get funds for transportation and transit. So hopefully someday that'll be a vehicle miles traveled kind of tax, which will eventually reduce the amount of money we get. But anyhow, funding like that was hurt because people weren't driving as much. And so some of our revenues are down in that regard. Now, in terms of other kinds of projects, I think you also asked about, we certainly, I mentioned things like ADA ramps. We also are looking at a reinvestment in our boulevard system. So Chicago, we have 26 miles of lakefront, but we have 26 miles of boulevards, and they all flow through these communities that I've been talking about. It's a really significant part of Chicago's DNA, right? It's stitched in these, and you can see a piece of it. Drexel Boulevard is in the image on the screen. These are these wide, wonderful green spaces that they're fine, but we haven't invested in them. We haven't made them great places to support communities in them. And it's a way of creating some connectivity across neighborhoods in need with the physical investments and the opportunity to have a conversation across neighborhoods. And that's something that we're thirsting for. I mean, when I talk with community organizers and they say, what people are asking for right now is to rebuild relationships with their neighbors, between social distancing, between what we're experiencing in terms of, protest and expressions of anger and joy and all kinds of things in our streets right now. People want to reconnect, and a physical project of that scale, and we're not going to do it in a year, but allows us to have those community conversations about what does our mutual front yard look like. So in respect to how that gets people employed, one of the amazing programs we have here in Chicago is something called Green Corps. And that is a program that gets folks who have challenges to employment, whether they're returning citizens from the criminal justice system, whether they are people who've experienced homelessness, they are folks who have bad credit. It trains folks in both landscape, environmental remediation, all kinds of skills that have everything to do with reconstruction of things like boulevards. And so we have a year-long training program, and then that group actually gets fee-for-service projects. That's the kind of thing where we can create, with a giant project, a much wider intake of people who really need to be connected to these kinds of industries, get the jobs out there, get the work done at the same time, and fundamentally be able to hire folks from communities where these boulevards are. That's the big vision. It's going to take us a while to get there, but that's, I think, a final example of a major undertaking that will leverage those funds, but do more than but bring back a major physical improvement. Well,
this is very exciting and great responses, and I fully agree. I think there is very good byproducts that we are not seeing as part of the pandemic. There is a lot of economic challenges, but I fully agree with, we're seeing people wanting to bike more than ever before, and really understanding the value of reconnecting with the neighbors and with the community. Something I think people are much more appreciating than before. So I see there is a lot of opportunities that are coming in the middle of all still the economic challenges that are coming with the pandemic.
Thank you. I just want to say it has been a wonderful presentation. As one of the attendants said, Anne Schneider said, that was very impressive articulation on how you're dealing with parallel issues, important issues from COVID to economic justice, to other areas of funding. So thank you, Commissioner Biagi, for a wonderful presentation. And I would like to repeat what I said before. Chicagoans are in really good hands with you and your mayor on really rethinking what it means to be a city and serve your citizens. I also would like to thank my co-moderator and respondent, Dr. Nora Algari, for your insightful questions. I also would like to thank the collaborating organizations, ACEC New York, AIA New York, ASCE, CMAA New York, New Jersey, CSU, ENR, and NAC. I also would like to thank some of our past speakers and co-moderators and that are present today. I also would like to thank Eric Borstein, Associate Commissioner for Public Buildings and the New York City Department of Design and Construction, and Mohammed Sadiq, Chief Engineer in the Office of the Queensboro President, for being with us today and listening to this wonderful presentation by Commissioner Biagi. I also would like to thank especially all of you out there in offices, agencies, at home, around New York City and around the world for taking time to listen today. Continuing education credits for architects are being requested. If you are seeking credit, please send your name by email to cbips@columbia.edu. I also would like to thank, in particular, the team at Columbia's Center for Buildings, Infrastructure, and Public Space, Michael Smith, Charles Cheng, and Rick Bell, without whom this of them that they have made this possible. On Tuesday, August 18, the 15th lecture in the series will be given by Dr. Penshua Shao, Chief Engineer, China Construction Third Engineering Bureau Group, the team that built the hospital in Wuhan in a week. My co-moderator will be Dr. Fan Dongping, Dean of the School of Engineering, Tsinghua University in Beijing. The speaker on Tuesday, August 25th, the 16th lecture in the series, will be given by Dr. Bugnan Lee, Professor at Seoul National University. My co-moderator will be Dr. Mansoor Park, Professor at Seoul National University. The speaker on Tuesday, September 1st, the 17th lecture in the series, will be Doug Maas, President of Cosentini Associates. My co-moderator will be Lance J. Brown, President of the Consortium for Sustainable Urbanization. The talk on Tuesday, September 18th, the 18th lecture in the series, will be given by Dr. Kathrik Chandran, Professor of Environmental Engineering at Columbia University, and my co-moderator will be Jay Simpson, President and Executive Director of AEC New York. On our website, cbips.engineering.columbia.edu, you can find information about our past lectures, including the PowerPoint presentations and videos recordings of the talk. You can also find information about upcoming lectures in the program. Presently added to the website are talks about reopening of workspaces, as well as ideas of reopening restaurants and bar spaces. With that, I would like to thank again Commissioner Biagi and Nora for your presentation and for your moderation. Thanks so much. We learned so much from this lecture, and we really appreciate your time. Thank you so much. Have a wonderful day.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you.